Long summer days spent in hunting, long winter's nights of revelry. But in the late 1520s, a shadow fell over the life of King Henry VIII with the failure of his first marriage, and the summer prince began to turn into the dark monster of legend. A shadow also fell over Tudor England. It was called Traitor's Gate.
In Tudor times, war was considered more noble than jaw. But, like Churchill, Henry VIII knew when to accept the inevitable and cement a peaceful alliance with a more powerful opponent.
May the friendship underlying the joint communique long...
The French and their Scottish allies had been soundly beaten in two great military victories. But the effort had exhausted England's comparatively small resources. Henry was also confronted with a new French king, Francis I, young and ambitious for glory like Henry VIII. In these circumstances, it was Wolsey's great idea to replace conflict in war with competition in peace. Starting with the Treaty of London, Wolsey set up a series of treaties and peace conferences which culminated in the most famous summit of all time, the Field of the Cloth of Gold.
Henry VIII set sail from Dover to Calais on the 31st of May, 1520. He travelled in the utmost luxury in a newly built ship, the Catherine Plaisance, and he was accompanied with 5,000 of the richest and most important people in England. 5,000 people. That means that it would actually take 6.5 Eurostars to take all of those people over to France. But remember, in the early 16th century, the population of England was very much smaller than it is now. It was actually 1/18th of the size. So to put things into a modern perspective, it would have taken 6 whole days of trains to get Henry VIII's enormous entourage across to France. And getting those figures back into 16th century terms, those 5,000 Englishmen met roughly the same number of Frenchmen here.
Near the entrance of the Channel Tunnel. In the 16th century, it was known as the Val d'Or, the Golden Valley. After the meeting, it became known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold. And of course, because the French, unlike us, have got a historical sense, when they actually opened the tunnel, they put a big Henry VIII on one side and an even bigger Francis I on the other.
The site itself, like the great statue of Ozymandias, King of Kings, has seen the ravages of time. What was once the hub of European politics is now just a field of maize. However, in the great hall of Wolsey's palace of Hampton Court, there's a more enduring monument of the glories of the Field of Cloth of Gold.
The meeting took place between the 7th and the 20th of June, 1520, and it was recorded in this extraordinary painting. The painting was executed years, if not actually decades, after the event.
Nevertheless, almost all the details are accurate, including even this fantastic dragon up there. Actually, it was a firework released by the English during the final mass, which marked the end of the meeting. To the left, there's the great procession of King Henry VIII and thousands of followers, including most of the English nobility. Next to the king, there's Cardinal Wolsey, and behind, there's the two dukes, Suffolk and Norfolk, whilst the procession wends its way towards the actual interview between Henry VIII and Francis I of France at the top. It takes place in a tent of cloth of gold. Cloth of gold, of course, giving its name to the whole meeting. Whilst to the right, there's the great temporary palace built by the English out of canvas and wood, painted to look like brick and stone, and fitted with huge glazed windows. It looks just like a pavilion at an international exhibition. But this isn't only Expo 1520. It was also an early 16th century Olympic Games. At the back, at the top there's the lists of the field where the main competition, the joust, took place. An Olympic Games and an international exhibition. These are events which allow for peaceful competition between nations. And the idea was that the Field of Cloth of Gold would herald a new era of peaceful competition between England and France. Peaceful international competition was a new idea then, a bit like détente at the end of the Cold War. But though Cardinal Wolsey didn't, unlike Henry Kissinger, win the Nobel Peace Prize, he carried off all the glittering prizes instead.
What America means.
As a result of his offices in church and state, Wolsey acquired an enormous fortune. His income was about 30,000 a year. That's a quarter of the king's. But Henry had to run Tudor England out of that. Wolsey only had to fund his lavish lifestyle. He acquired an extraordinary collection of tapestries and of silver, but above all, he built heavily. The most famous surviving monument of Wolsey's is Hampton Court. John Skelton, the poet and Henry VIII's former tutor, wrote satirically, "Why come ye not to court?" And he answered, "To the King's Court or to Hampton Court? For Hampton Court is the finer, Hampton Court is the sweeter, Hampton Court is the better." Peace with France gave Henry VIII time to indulge in the more relaxing aspects of kingship. He could hunt, joust and feast. He had everything a king of England could want, except a legitimate male heir. Another war with France intervened, with the French making occasional hit-and-run attacks on the south coast. They were even unkind enough on one occasion to sack Brighton. But Wolsey quickly negotiated another peace treaty with Henry's old enemy. These idyllic days were not to last for Wolsey. An ancient skeleton was about to fall out of the cupboard. By the middle of the 1520s, Queen Catherine of Aragon's position was being undermined in three ways. First, and most importantly, she'd failed to give Henry the male heir that he so desperately wanted. In the 16th century, it was the woman who was blamed for that kind of failure. Instead, she'd given birth to a single daughter, Mary. Mary had actually been created Princess of Wales and sent off to rule Wales. But there were real doubts as to whether she could actually succeed Henry. Indeed, a recently discovered document suggests that it would actually have been illegal. So, just to make sure, Henry promoted his bastard son, he was the son of Elizabeth Blunt, his early mistress, and made him Duke of Richmond and sent him off to rule the north. The idea perhaps was that he could have become heir to the throne. Catherine's second failure was personal and sexual. She'd failed as a woman. She'd had this great sequence of stillbirths and miscarriages, perhaps 10 or 12 in all. They'd left her bloated, misshapen, fat. By this time, of course, she was well past childbearing age. In the circumstances, she turned to the consolations of religion, as so many women do. But of course, there was a third point, and that was diplomatic. The marriage between Henry and Catherine had always been as much diplomatic as personal. It symbolized an alliance between England and Spain, and later on, the great territories of the Habsburgs, represented at this time by the Habsburg Emperor Charles V. The reason for this alliance and its importance was that the great weight of Spain and the Habsburg lands could be swung into England's struggle against the hereditary traditional enemy of France. But the great achievement of Henry's first minister, Cardinal Wolsey, was precisely to normalize relations between England and France. And these efforts at normalization culminated in 1527. There were a series of extraordinary and splendid festivities. There was equally an extraordinary and splendid peace treaty. Rather blasphemously, it was called the Treaty of Eternal Peace. Now, a serious peace between England and France made the alliance with Spain redundant, and therefore made Catherine, the symbol of that alliance, redundant as well. But the peace treaty and the negotiations raised a further, even more insidious problem. The normal way in which you tied fast a peace treaty at that time was by means of a marriage. And the obvious couple to be married were Henry's daughter, Mary, and the son, the Dauphin Francois, the son of Francis I, King of France. But perhaps as a ploy during the marriage negotiations, a question was raised by one of the French representatives. Was Mary really Henry's legitimate daughter? Were Henry and Catherine really married? The doubts sown began to fester in Henry's mind, and the doubts grew and developed and turned into certainties. And they did so when in this same year of 1527, Henry met and fell in love passionately with Anne Boleyn.
Hever Castle in Kent. Sir Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, was a major figure at court, and, either at court or in the country, Henry met and fell head over heels in love with Anne. Despite hating writing, and despite his 36 years, Henry wrote a series of lengthy and passionate love letters to Anne, including one celebrating her pretty little breasts, or duckies.
Wishing myself, especially of an evening, in my sweetheart's arms, whose pretty duckies I trust shortly to kiss, written with the hand that was, is, and shall be yours by his will, Henry R.
But one thing stood between Anne's little duckies and Henry: the fact that Henry had been married to Catherine of Aragon for nearly 20 years. Or had he? Only the church could decide.
Golden mosaic, bronze reliefs, marble panelled walls, beveled mirrors. The great monastery of Blackfriars contained some of the largest and most splendid accommodation in London. This made it a natural choice when the Emperor Charles V visited his aunt and uncle, Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, in 1522. At that time, the monastery was linked with a bridge and a gallery going across the River Fleet, which lies out there, to the neighbouring palace of Bridewell. Bridewell had been built by Henry VIII to replace the accommodation that he'd lost when the residential section of the Palace of Westminster burnt down in 1512-13. Bridewell, Blackfriars, was a great palace monastery, rather like Holyrood. This made it a natural choice for one of the great events of 16th century history. Indeed, one of the great events of history, the public trial of a king and a queen and the validity of their marriage. By the way, all this splendour, this marble and glass, doesn't belong to a palace, but to a gin palace, good old English pub that stands on the site of Blackfriars Monastery.
The Blackfriars trial was organised by Cardinal Wolsey, who sat, rather uncomfortably, as both the King's principal counsellor and the Pope's direct representative, or legate, in England. There were two judges, Wolsey and Cardinal Campeggio, who had been sent from Rome as the Pope's special representative. They would have to consider whether marriage to a brother's widow was forbidden by God as incest, and whether, even if it were, the Pope had power to set aside divine law. Henry protested that the issue was a matter of conscience. If it were proved that Catherine really were his wife, he said he would be delighted to take her back. The truth, however, was that he was determined to get an annulment, by any means, providing they looked publicly all right.
On the 21st of June, 1529, the full session of the Legatine Court opened.
When the usher cried, "Catherine, Queen of England, come into court," Catherine made no reply. Instead, she swept across the court and threw herself at Henry's feet. She then spoke to him in her broken English.
Sir, I beseech you for all the loves that have been between us, and for the love of God, let me have justice and right. I flee to you as the head of justice within this realm. I take God and all the world to witness that I have been to you a true, humble, and obedient wife. Therefore, I most humbly require you, in the way of charity and for the love of God, who is the just judge, to spare me the extremity of this new court. And if he will not, to God I commit my cause.
The Queen then walked out of the court,
and steadfastly refused to return. It was now Henry's turn to put his case. He highlighted his fear that his failure to have a son was God's judgment on his marriage. The lawyers then got to work. As well as the questions of law, much of the case focused, with an abundance of detail, on whether Catherine had really slept with Arthur. The debate, inevitably, was inconclusive. And on the 23rd of June, Cardinal Campeggio, invoking secret instructions, suddenly revoked the whole case to Rome. From the body of the court, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, swore, "It was never merry in England when we had cardinals among us." The threat to Cardinal Wolsey was unmistakable.
On the 29th of October, 1529, Wolsey left his palace of York Place to ride the few hundred yards to Westminster Hall, where he would sit in his own court as Lord Chancellor. It was the first day of the Michaelmas term, and normally Wolsey would have been accompanied with all the other lords of the council. But today was not an ordinary day. Everyone knew that the Cardinal's fall was imminent, so the lords had ridden off to join the king at Windsor. Wolsey sat alone in one corner of the hall, whilst in another, in the Court of King's Bench, he was indicted on the terrible charge of praemunire.
Praemunire was the name given to the offence of trying to introduce foreign, that is to say papal law, or the law of Rome, into England. Nowadays, the Eurosceptics seem to have lost the struggle against the importation of European law. But in the reign of Henry VIII, the law was Eurosceptic. The penalty for introducing foreign law was terrible. It was life imprisonment and the confiscation of all property. Faced with this terrible penalty, Wolsey admitted the charge. He was spared the life imprisonment, but most of his vast accumulation of property was confiscated by the king. It was like a Harrod's sail. Even in defeat, Wolsey was stylish. He ordered that the rooms and galleries of his great palace of York Place be arrayed with all his wealth, gold in one room, silver in another, and everywhere precious tapestries. Henry even brought his new mistress, Anne Boleyn, on a kind of shopping expedition to view the display. Henry still retained a considerable affection for Wolsey. Some of his wealth was restored to him, and, encouraged by this, Wolsey hoped for a total restoration of his offices and power. Among his other titles, Wolsey was Archbishop of York, and whilst he'd always taken the money, he had never even visited York. Now he arranged for a great ceremonial installation as Archbishop at York Minster. This was too much for Henry, and, egged on by Anne Boleyn, he ordered Wolsey's arrest for treason. Wolsey fell ill on his way to the Tower and died at Leicester. Thomas More had first met Henry when the Prince was a little boy at Eltham. More was then a promising law student in London, but he was also very interested in religion and spent some time living in the great London monastery of the Charterhouse. But in 1518, there came his big break. He was summoned to court as one of the king's 2 councillors in residence. This gave More uniquely close access to Henry, and his biographer and son-in-law, William Roper, describes how the king and Thomas More would walk arm in arm upon the leads of the flat part of the roof, looking up at the stars and talking about astronomy. More practically, More also helped Henry in writing his book against Martin Luther called The Assertion of the Seven Sacraments. In return for this, a grateful pope gave Henry the title of Defender of the Faith, a title still used by British monarchs and found in the abbreviated Latin form of FD on every coin of the realm. More's reward was the Chancellorship of the Duchy of Lancaster, and it is as Chancellor of the Duchy, wearing his great chain of SS's, that he appears in the famous portrait dated 1527 by his friend and house guest, Hans Holbein.
In 1529, Sir Thomas More was appointed Lord Chancellor in succession to Cardinal Wolsey. One of his jobs, just the same as the Lord Chancellor's now, was to preside over the House of Lords. It was an unusual appointment in two ways. More was one of the first laymen, as opposed to clergy, to hold the position. He was also unusual because he actually took the job on conditions. He said to Henry, "I will only be your Lord Chancellor if I have nothing at all to do with your divorce." And Henry, this is still the nice younger Henry, said yes. But Thomas More had few illusions. On one occasion he remarked, "If my head would gain the king a castle in France, it were off tomorrow." On another, he was in conversation with his friend the Duke of Norfolk about his hostile attitude towards the divorce. "Remember," the Duke warned him, "ira principis mors est." The wrath of the prince is death. In that case, More jokingly replied, "I'll die today, and you will die tomorrow." It was a case of a true word spoken in jest, for More's prophecy was more than half true. 1,500 years of tradition gave the power and responsibility for trying the validity of Henry's first marriage to this man, Pope Clement VII. It was he who would have to decide whether or not Catherine were Henry VIII's true wife and Mary were his legitimate daughter. But in fact, the Pope enjoyed very little freedom of action, and that was because of this man, the Emperor Charles V. The Emperor Charles V was Catherine's nephew. He also had complete control of Italy and Rome, and under no circumstances would he permit the dishonour to his family of his aunt's divorce. That meant if Henry were to be divorced, finally he would have to be divorced in England. But here too there was an obstacle, in the form of the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Wareham. Wareham was already a very old man when he'd been painted by Holbein in the 1520s. He was even older now, but age only increased the obstinacy and courage with which he resisted Henry's moves for divorce. But in August 1532, Wareham died. This left the way open for the appointment of a new Archbishop of Canterbury. The chosen candidate was Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer had been chaplain to the Boleyn family. This meant that he could be guaranteed to view favourably both Henry's divorce from Catherine and his remarriage to Anne Boleyn. But even then, you know, England was an island in name only, and Henry owed his freedom of manoeuvre to the head of the other European great power, Francis I of France. It was October 1532. Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were returning from a most successful meeting with Francis I at Boulogne. By this time, Henry and Anne had actually been together for about 3 years. She was his known mistress, if not exactly his practicing one. The problem then, of course it's still one that afflicts our royal family today, was how you actually transform a mistress into a wife. The meeting with Francis I was a very important part of that process. At the beginning, there was a bit of a hitch. The ladies of the French court, led by the Queen, refused point blank to meet the English whore, as Anne Boleyn was rather unkindly known. But Francis I himself turned up and entertained them royally. It was now safe for Anne to turn from mistress into wife. Secure in this knowledge, perhaps even on the return voyage, Henry and Anne slept together for the first time. Within a month, Queen Elizabeth I was conceived. This is the Cosmati pavement below the high altar in Westminster Abbey. This mosaic pavement, made out of precious marbles, was laid by Italian craftsmen in the reign of Henry III. Henry VIII was crowned here, so was Anne Boleyn. And Holbein probably stood about here to sketch it for inclusion in his great painting, The Ambassadors. The painting shows an ambassador sent to London to persuade Henry to wait until Francis I of France had obtained the Pope's agreement for Henry's divorce and remarriage. But this would require time. With Anne Boleyn pregnant, time was in short supply. Instead, Parliament passed an act which gave the Archbishop of Canterbury power to settle all marital cases in England without recourse to Rome. Archbishop Cranmer then proclaimed the marriage of Henry and Catherine null and void, which made their daughter, Mary, a bastard.
and he validated Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, which had occurred in secret some weeks earlier, and made the issue from their marriage the legitimate heirs to the throne.
Whitsunday, the 1st of June, 1533, Anne Boleyn was going to be crowned Queen of England. Anne was actually the only one of Henry's queens, apart from Catherine of Aragon, to be crowned. Henry had gone to so much trouble with his second marriage that he was determined that his new queen should have as much honour and dignity as possible. So, from Greenwich to the Tower, there was a splendid water pageant. In the Tower, the royal apartments had been rebuilt specially for her. And from the Tower to Westminster, there was another splendid procession, in which one of the pageants had been designed by the great Hans Holbein himself. But there was one thing that Henry, not even Henry, could give his new wife, and that was popularity. Just imagine, Queen Anne, Queen Camilla. Some members of the crowd even decided to have a little joke. The cipher of Henry and Anne, which appeared everywhere in the decorations, cipher that means their joint initials, was H.A. So what did the spectators do?
All nations face new challenges and choices.
Anne Boleyn was about as popular as Hillary Clinton. She was not only unpopular as a royal mistress like Camilla Parker Bowles, she was unpopular as a woman with strong radical opinions of her own, who interfered in her husband's politics. Henry's second marriage put in place new pieces into the jigsaw of Tudor power. There was Henry's new wife, Anne Boleyn, her family, headed by her father and her brother, and there were many others too who cast their lot with the newly ascendant faction. But for many more, the king's new marriage presented them with an intolerable conflict of loyalties. Take, for instance, Lord Mountjoy. Mountjoy had been the companion of Henry's boyhood and his youth, but he'd also been Lord Chamberlain to Queen Catherine, and he'd actually married one of her ladies-in-waiting. Look then at the position that he was put in when he was ordered to tell Catherine that she was no longer queen, that she would no longer have the servants that belonged to a queen, but instead would be treated as a mere Princess of Wales. Effectively, he shrugged his shoulders and gave up. Others, of course, responded more vigorously. Thomas More, whose acquaintance with Henry was as old as Lord Mountjoy's, turned against the new marriage on grounds of principle. Henry's sister, Mary, turned against it on grounds essentially of snobbery. She thought Anne Boleyn was a bit lower class, and she took with her her husband, Henry's oldest friend, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. The same was true even of Henry's closest blood relations, the Poles and the Courtenays. They too cast their lot with Catherine. The result was that Henry's second marriage split apart the political fabric of Tudor England. Henry didn't only break with Rome, he broke with his own family. Most of those who've been closest with Henry stuck with Catherine.
This magnificent room is the King's Library. It forms part of the British Library in Great Russell Street, and it was built to accommodate the collection given to the nation by King George IV. But the original Royal Library was formed around the collection of King Henry VIII. Of course, kings before Henry had had books too, but theirs were acquired largely because they were either pretty to look at or amusing, or usually both. King Henry's library was different. It was a working library and acquired for a purpose. Most of the books were acquired quickly and in bulk from places like Rochester Abbey. They were also arranged in a fashion that was designed to facilitate ease of reference. There was a single alphabetical catalogue, itself very unusual at the time, and even more unusually, the books were given catalogue numbers. Even the way the books look tell us that they were designed to be used. They had a rather utilitarian kind of binding. It was made out of wood, covered in velvet, and then on the front you had the title written on a slip of paper. The slip of paper was covered with transparent horn tacked down at the corners so that it didn't get smudged from heavy use. And when you open the book and you look at the title page, on the top right-hand corner, there is the catalogue number. And we know that Henry VIII did indeed work in his royal library because of annotations in the king's very characteristic handwriting in several of the books. Some of the most interesting are in this, which is a book of canon law. And Henry has noted the passages which particularly relate to his case at Rome for the ending of his first marriage. So here we have a note on the chapter dealing with appeals, another by the chapter dealing with the Pope's power to correct kings. But perhaps the most interesting deal with a rather more intimate matter. There's a passage which discusses the value of chastity in marriage, and by it Henry has noted, in Latin of course, therefore not in our case. But Henry and his team of scholars used the Royal Library for a larger purpose, to develop the theoretical arguments that underpin the royal supremacy. Using books like this, Henry persuaded himself that he was in right and in law supreme head of the church. That meant that he was in right and law the heir of Christ and the apostles, like the Pope. Therefore he, the king, like the Pope, had the right to bind men's consciences. Therefore he, like the Pope, was infallible. These are claims that correspond to the most extravagant pretensions of 20th century dictatorships. Thomas More found them utterly intolerable.
Thomas More resigned the chancellorship the day that Convocation, that is, the Parliament of the Church, proclaimed Henry the supreme head on earth of the Church of England. And 3 years later, More was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower for refusing to swear an oath acknowledging Henry as the supreme head of the Church and renouncing the power of the Pope.
This is the bell tower in the Tower of London. Thomas More was imprisoned here for over a year before his trial and execution in 1535. His martyrdom is one of the most famous, infamous if you like, in English history. But it's very important to be clear about the grounds why More was prepared to sacrifice himself. Obviously, he was opposed to the rupture of Henry's marriage with Catherine of Aragon and his new marriage with Anne Boleyn. But finally, he was prepared to accept that. He was even prepared to swear to accept Princess Elizabeth as the legitimate heir to England. What he could not accept, however, were the grounds of the decision to divorce Henry and Catherine. That was Henry's proclamation that he was supreme head on earth of the Church of England. That made him, Henry, and through him, England, supreme not only over men's bodies, More could accept that, but over men's consciences and souls. That More could not accept.
This is VIII in Oxfordshire. It was one of the principal residences of the de la Pole family, Dukes of Suffolk, and its surviving 15th century buildings in soft red brick bring out more clearly than almost anywhere else the relationship between the nobility, the church, and the people. The Dukes of Suffolk lived in the palatial manor house, of which only a small part still stands. And next to the church, they endowed the hospital to care for the elderly poor, and the school to educate the young. So VIII was both an early Tudor welfare state and a vision of the essential unity of all Christians, whatever their social status, in the body of Christ. The Dukes rebuilt the church as an expression of their piety, and one of the duchesses, Alice, granddaughter of the great poet Geoffrey Chaucer, is buried here. At the beginning of the 16th century, the de la Poles rebelled against Henry VII. Their estates were confiscated, and VIII became a royal palace.
Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn came here in the early summer of 1535. It was the start of the summer progress. Normally, the progress was a time for pleasure. This one was for business as well, and the business was the furtherance of the English Reformation. This was to undo almost everything that VIII and places like it stood for.
The Reformation was about replacing an old religion with a new religion. The old religion was about pilgrimages, miracle-working shrines, and hoping that your favourite saint would be able to get you into heaven by the back door. The new religion was about reading the Bible and understanding it, listening to sermons and understanding them. It was a thinking man's and woman's religion. Words and ideas had replaced smells and bells.
During the progress, Henry decided to advertise his commitment to the Reformation by staying in the houses of local gentlemen who were known to favour the new developments in religion. One of the most important of these was Nicholas Poyntz of Iron Acton. And Nicholas was so pleased with the thought of a visit from the King and the Queen that he rebuilt one of the wings of his house. It still stands, and we've still got wall paintings executed in the latest French fashion on one of the walls. And in his portrait by Hans Holbein, you can see him dressed in the latest French fashion, with even a French-trimmed beard as well. The dissolution of the monasteries also started on this progress. The King's great minister, Thomas Cromwell, joined the royal party on the 27th of July, and at Winchcombe he personally began the visitation of the monasteries. Anne Boleyn was there too, and she ordered at Winchcombe that the great relic of the Holy Blood of Hales was to be investigated on suspicion of fraud.
And at the heart of the old religion were the monasteries. Within the shrine of the Holy Blood of Hales was a phial supposedly containing Christ's blood, which miraculously liquefied each year on Corpus Christi Day. This sideshow and others like it generated vast income for the monasteries. Hales Abbey was the theme park version of the old religion, a sort of medieval Alton Towers. Its intellectual powerhouse, however, was in the Charterhouse in London, where the monks led solitary, austere lives in cells like these. The monks spoke out passionately against Henry's supreme headship of the Church and were eager to be martyrs to the old faith. Henry was only too happy to oblige with one of the most horrible deaths imaginable.
On the 4th of May, 1535, John Houghton, the prior of the London Charterhouse, and 4 other monks and priests were dragged on hurdles behind horses from the tower to the place of execution, here on the site of the modern Marble Arch. There, the full horrors of hanging, drawing, and quartering were visited on each of them in turn. They were hanged for a few moments and cut down whilst they were still alive. Then the real horror began. First, their private parts were cut off and burned in front of their faces. Then their bellies were ripped open, their bowels torn out and burned as well. All of this time, they were alive, conscious, and praying quietly. Finally, their heads were cut off and their bodies were hacked roughly into 4 pieces. It was a huge crowd. The whole of the court had turned out, including Henry Norris, the King's principal private servant. Rumour had it that Henry himself would very much like to have been there too. After his execution at Tyburn, one of Prior John Houghton's butchered quarters was brought here and nailed to the doors of his own monastery. It was intended as an awful warning to the monks inside who were still trying to lead their ordinary lives. It's a testimony to their bravery that the warning, horrible though it was, failed.
The Carthusians had embraced martyrdom eagerly. Thomas More was tricked into denying the royal supremacy. But when he was condemned in Westminster Hall, he too spoke out boldly, undermining both the intellectual and the legal foundations of Henry's royal supremacy.
On the 6th of July, 1535, Sir Thomas More was told that he was to die. It was a moment for which he'd been preparing himself for years, and he contrived to die with both humour and dignity. The scaffold was tall, and the steps up to it were very rickety, so he turned to the lieutenant of the tower and asked for his hand to see him safely up. On the way down, More said, "I can shift for myself." He'd been told to use very few words in his speech, so he simply asked the crowd to pray for the king that he might have good counsel. And he protested, "I have been the king's good servant, but God's first." As he knelt down on the block, he carefully moved his long beard out of the way, saying, "Well, at least my beard hasn't committed treason."
The arrest, imprisonment and execution of Sir Thomas More marked the most important development of the 1530s, the ascendancy of radicals in Henry VIII's councils. First, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who'd granted Henry his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. And then, and much the most important, Thomas Cromwell, who became the King's chief minister in 1532. Cromwell was quite one of the most remarkable men of the age. Humble origins, first a mercenary soldier, and then a lawyer. He finished up as Cardinal Wolsey's chief legal advisor. And when his master fell in 1529, he'd been the person who tried to rescue something from the wreckage of his fortunes. Henry VIII was seriously impressed, and he summoned him to court. And there Cromwell quickly rose to the top. He promised Henry, it's reliably alleged, that he would make him the richest monarch in Christendom. He also showed himself a master of the deadly arts of court intrigue, a kind of Peter Mandelson of the court of Henry VIII. But there's actually something a little strange in all this. Henry had nothing in common socially with Thomas Cromwell. He'd virtually nothing in common religiously with Thomas Cranmer. He put up with them because only they would support and support passionately his astonishing radical policy of making himself supreme head of the Church of England, defying the papacy and defying Christendom. Now, the chief victim of this radical ascendancy was poor Catherine of Aragon herself. After her divorce, she was forced into a reluctant, miserable retirement, and she finally died in January 1536. Henry VIII was callous enough to wear yellow for mourning and to dance when the news of his first wife's death was brought to him. His new wife, Anne Boleyn, joined in the dancing. But there's an irony here. So long as his first wife was still alive, there was no possibility that Henry VIII could repudiate his second, because Anne herself was vulnerable. She'd failed in just the same way that Catherine had failed. She'd not given Henry that much-needed, much-longed-for male heir. So Catherine's death left Anne Boleyn open to her enemies, and she'd many of those. It was May Day, 1536. A great joust was being held at Greenwich. There were two chief contestants, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, Anne Boleyn's brother, and Henry Norris, the groom of the stool, and the King's chief body servant. Anne Boleyn herself presided as the Queen of the May. One account actually has her throwing down her handkerchief into the lists. It was picked up by Norris, who rode with it tied to his arm as a kind of love trophy. The whole thing was like a scene out of the court of King Arthur, Sir Lancelot jousting before Queen Guinevere. But Henry's mood suddenly turned black, and he left the joust before the end to ride back to London. He took Norris with him. On the way, he accused him to his face of sleeping with the Queen. Vehemently, the groom of the stool denied it. Henry offered him his life. He still denied it. He was dropped off at the Tower on the way back. Anne tried to make the next day, the 2nd of May, as normal a day as possible. She even watched a tennis match, regretting that she hadn't betted on the winner. But in the late morning, she was interrogated before the council, and in the afternoon, she was taken by water from Greenwich to the Tower. Curious Londoners gathered to watch, some in boats on the river, others on the riverbank. Once in the Tower, Anne collapsed. She fell on her knees, protesting her innocence. Then she turned to the lieutenant of the Tower and said, "Master Lieutenant, shall I go to a dungeon?" He said, "No, ma'am. You will be put in the lodgings you had before your coronation." And then she said, "Shall I have justice?" He said, "Madam, the poorest subject in England has justice." And then she laughed. In her interrogation before the council, Queen Anne Boleyn had been remarkably self-possessed. However, when she got into the Tower, she dropped her guard with her ladies and talked freely. Too freely.
I asked Master Norris why he did not go through with his marriage, and he made answer he would tarry a time. And then I said, "You look for dead man's shoes, for if aught came to the king but good, you would look to have me."
Every word that Anne said was passed on to the Lieutenant of the Tower, who wrote daily reports to Thomas Cromwell. On the basis of these reports, Anne Boleyn was put on trial in Westminster Hall, where only 3 years before she had presided over her coronation banquet. The charges were multiple adultery and incest with her own brother. The evidence was sensational, even by the standards of the House of Windsor. From the windows of her lodgings in the Tower, Anne could see the ravens who awaited her fate. Ravens, unlike kings and queens, mate for life. The sentence for a woman who was condemned to death for treason wasn't to be hanged, drawn and quartered like a man. Instead, it was to be burned alive. Anne Boleyn was terrified of this horrible method of execution, and for once, Henry VIII decided to be merciful. Instead, she should be beheaded, but not with an axe, a great clumsy axe in the English fashion, but instead in the French fashion, with a broadsword. The executioner and the sword were brought over from Calais, and Anne Boleyn, on the morning of the 19th of May, 1536, was brought here to the scaffold at Tower Green. She made her speech, a prayer, knelt down, her great mantle furred with ermines was removed, that wonderful auburn hair was tied up inside a little cap, and she knelt down, but not at the block, instead keeping her head upright. And the executioner raised the sword, and it swung faster and faster, and the head came off with a single stroke.
And you can see the final part of David Starkey's assessment of King Henry VIII tomorrow at the same time.